Today is May 28th. I'm Nancy Ungerman, and I'll be interviewing Gordon Frank. And we're at the Jewish Community Center, and the videographer is Ruth Andrus. Hello.
Hello.
I'm going to start way before you were around. Tell me about your grandparents, or if you know, your great-grandparents. Where were they born?
Well, let's see, the great-grandparents, I'll go on my mother's side first, all from New Orleans. And they arrived, that must have been the great-great-grandparents, in 1820 in New Orleans, and settled there. And this is where my mother was born, later, of course. And there was a large family. Some of them were the Haspels, the clothing company. Louder? Okay, I just don't want to frighten people. That's okay. The Haspels were part of the family, the clothing company. So I wore their suits for years. There were many others, the Sternbergs. I could go down the line. But my grandmother grew up there. She had 4 sisters, whom all I met as I was born and grew up later. And
Your grandparents, that would be in the 1860s?
this would be 1850, 1856, 1880 maybe. I never knew my grandfathers either side, but the grandmother I was very close to. So I don't know if you want me to take it from that point on.
Well, I'm wondering about the other side.
Well, first on my mother's side, it's kind of fascinating because my great-grandfather was head of the, they call it the store, or company store, for Judah P. Benjamin's plantation. Now, Judah P. Benjamin was the secretary of the Confederacy. He was also a senator before that from the state of Louisiana in Washington, and a successful attorney. So he had a big plantation there. Some of the buildings still exist. We visited those. In fact, the bell from the plantation is in the town south of New Orleans. I think it's Pointe-a-la-Hache in that area. And it's in the park there. So it's still well known. So it's kind of an interesting history to me. And my great-grandfather, on my mother's side, was a Confederate lieutenant. I have the battalion, company, all of it, platoon that he was in, and I have his commissioning papers from 1861. So it's kind of fascinating. He was in the Battle of Shiloh, and people ask me, when they ask me what battles was I in the Great War, I went into the Great War. I don't know, so many wars since then. I tell them I was in the Battle of Shiloh. And these are usually young people, 28, 30, articulate, but know nothing about history or care. They said, where was that? I said, it's Tennessee. And they said, well, I didn't know there were battles in Tennessee. Oh, yeah. I said, there are other battles. The second battle of Manassas. What state is that? Where were you? I said, in Virginia. There are battles in Virginia. I didn't want to refer to George Washington, General Lee, or anything like that. So they say, well, what year was this? I says, 1862, referring to myself.
Yeah.
Then they know I'm pulling their legs. See. At any rate, that's kind of the history there.
Well, then I'm going to go back even further. Great.
As far as I know, they came from France. Now, everybody in France at some time or other had to come from further east, I'm sure. So this could have been Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. So we're going back probably to the 1700s. I know nothing about that group. So at any rate, that's the whole thing in a nutshell as far as New Orleans goes. They also sent me to high school there from Arkansas. They wanted me to get the best education before I entered the war, World War II. And they gave me a choice of Culver Military Academy in Indiana. I always loved the military anyway. My father, incidentally, had been in World War I. Now we'll come to his side. Should I shift now to that side of the family?
Sure.
Okay. He was born in a little village called Laufensteiler in Germany. which is between Frankfurt and Trier. Now, history, my wife and I fortunately enjoy it, maps and everything else, and all the history of military history particularly. So he came over to this country in 1908, so he was about 14 years old. Some of his uncles had preceded him by 20 years and were pretty well established in Mississippi, Arkansas, and St. Louis. So he had family to go to, didn't speak a word of English. But in those days, when you arrived in this country, you were known as a greenhorn. It wasn't a complimentary term. So he was anxious to learn English as fast as possible. And he went to St. Louis from New York. When he came in, the ship was called the Spotterland.
What was his last name?
Frank.
Frank?
Alexander or Alec Frank.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty big fellow, huge hands. He was raised in the horse dealing business, or Pferdhandler as it was called, in Germany. So as my grandfather, who was born in 1856 in Germany. And he settled in this little village. And horses, now these weren't race horses, these were dray horses like Anheuser-Busch uses to drag their beer around in. And they traded between Frankfurt, Trier, and the town and the whole area, the farmland and that sort of thing, farm horses. I was there, but I'll get to that. When I was 3.5 years old, they took me on a 3-month trip to Europe, which was pretty brave. Anyway, so he arrived here straight to St. Louis and went to join one of his family, whom he never met before. And they were going to raise him as their own in a way, but his father was still living then too, and his mother, my grandmother. So he lasted for about 6 months there. And he was kind of felt insulted because his English was poor at that time. But the kids, his cousins, had all been born in St. Louis. So they were citizens. And they all made fun of his accent. He says, I don't have to take this. So he shoved off. He says, I'm leaving. So he went to some small town called Newport, Arkansas, where another uncle had a store. Said, glad to have you. And then he went to Jonesboro, Arkansas, which was a larger town. And I remember seeing the house there was 2 big lions in front. They believed in doing that in those days. So he started to work in that store. They had me sweeping sawdust. And he spent about a month doing that, and he said, this is not my life. He says, I'd rather work for myself and sell pencils or apples on the street than have a boss. And that was always his attitude. I'm never going to have a boss. So they bossed him around sweeping the sawdust. That was good for 3 months. And he said, I won't use the words, but, stick it. And by this time, he had become fairly Americanized. Could speak English pretty well. And,
Married at the time?
Oh, no, he was, I guess he was, I was 19 maybe, something like that. Yeah, probably 19. So he met another fellow who happened to be from Tyler, Texas, and his name was Schoenbrun. Well, his son, or his nephew, is a pretty well-known lawyer here in Dallas, has been for years, Larry Schoenbrun. So at any rate, that's beside the point, but it's kind of history.
Good.
And this fellow's name was Major. That was his real name, Major Schoenbrun. And they became immediate pals. And they started to decide, well, how can we make a living? We can shoot and trap furs in Louisiana. So I have a wonderful photo of my dad and Major Schoenbrun, whom I met later as a young guy. And they were holding their pistols across like this. And in those days, they dressed in dress coats, shirt, and a tie, and a dress hat. And that's how they're dressed to go hunting. So this lasted for a few months. And so finally, my father finally arrived in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, at that time a town of about 40,000. And it had a pretty nice city. They had a temple there and so forth. He wasn't that interested by then in temples. He just wanted to make a living and enjoy life. And he was on his own, really. So by this time, he had 2 other brothers that came over, younger than my dad. My dad was the oldest, who came over from Laufersweiler and went to St. Louis, the usual place, and stayed there for quite a while. So while my dad was working in a department store in Pine Bluff, It was called Frugs, F-R-U-G-S. And he began to meet people in the town. There was a pretty sizable Jewish population, a good-sized temple. Must have been at least 800 people there, at least. And a pretty fashionable city. And my uncle, my mother's brother, had gone to Columbia University. He was pretty young in those days, you know. And, well, I'll get back to all that later. So anyway, how he met my mother, he was waiting on people selling shoes, which he loved doing anyway. And all these young girls would come in Pine Bluff. A lot of them were in college. My mother was going to the University of Chicago, which was kind of unusual in those days. And they had moved from Bonham, Texas. We'll get back to that. And so he would wait on these gals that would come in, 17, 18 years old. And he saw one that particularly appealed to him, happened to be my mother. But apparently in those days, you needed a formal invitation. I mean, you just didn't walk up and say, my name's so-and-so, let's go to the bar, that sort of thing. That was not there yet. And he just wanted an invitation, never was able to get that. But he became active in the Jewish community and other things too. And there was always big clubs there. They had the same name all over the country. I can't recall what the name was. Boys and girls, well, 16 up to 20, 22, and they organized dances. So he became the program chairman for one of the dances. And it was always held in the Pines Hotel, which in those days, and it's still there, was an 8-story building with a winding staircase, this sort of thing. So the girls would come down in their dress gowns, and the men were dressed in their tux. He was about 19, 20 years old. And he presented everybody like sort of like the debutantes do, or used to in Dallas, Little Rock too. And so this was about 1917. By that time, we had entered the war, World War I. And so he was drafted, and anxious to go. Every young guy was, as all of us were at one time or another. So they asked him what he had done in civilian life. He said, well, primarily I was in the horse business. Well, this was perfect. They immediately assigned him to the cavalry. Now, the cavalry had almost gone out of vogue in those days because of the way wars were fought, but we still had a large cavalry unit. So they sent him to New Orleans, and then they joined this group, unit, and they shipped him off to Arizona. On the way, they stopped in Marshall, Texas, the troop train. And he remembered that because the temperature was about 110, and they were in their high-collared uniforms, not comfortable at all. And these weren't Pullman cars. And they had a march down the main street of Marshall, the whole battalion. He says, I thought I was going to drop dead from the heat. Anyway, they finally arrived in Arizona on the Mexican border, Douglas, Arizona, Camp Jones. I know these things because I love the history, and I've written all this down anyway. So the first duty was a horse. They organized the troop. He probably knew more about horses than all of the rest of the men in the whole regiment, because most of them had never been around horses. They were farmers, but not like he had. So he was made a sergeant right away, and he was proud of that. Now, of course, it was on his record that he was a native of Germany. Now, by this time, he spoke English quite well, no problems at all. So they were chasing Pancho Villa, the famous, in Mexico. That was a whole deal. He had raided New Mexico before that, the town of Columbus, blew away a few American citizens, and so they were after him. And General Pershing was in charge of that.
Right.
That's why they called him Black Jack Pershing, because a lot of the members of the regiment were melanotic, as we euphemistically put it. They were blacks. But that's not important here one way or another. So they chased on the horses, and they galloped over Mexico, and never caught him. But I've got wonderful photographs of him, his horse, and his saber, uniform, and the whole thing, I mean, to this day, and that was in 1918. So at any rate, he'd been there now for 2 months, and he finally asked his captain, Captain Wilson, I never met the man, he wanted to know, why aren't you sending me overseas? He says, I'm trained here. He says, I know the country well. So he says, so you, slight interruption here, folks.
We don't like that.
I'm making this too long, I'm
No,
sure,
you're
too
not.
much detail.
No, I don't.
So at any rate, he asked the captain, he says, why aren't you sending me overseas? He says, I think I'd be an advantage here. I know horses well, as you know, and so forth. And he told him, he says, well, Frank, he called him by his last name, he says, I have to be honest with you, when I look at your records here, you were a German citizen. So you still have relatives there, which he did, a lot of cousins, who happened to be members of the Imperial German Army, who are our enemy. He says, we could trust you, between you and I and the rest of us, but it just can't be done. We just would worry about that, you know. So he understood it. He says, well, I've got maps, old maps I brought with me, roads you never heard of that are there. He says, it just can't help. So he said, okay, that was that. By then they folded the cavalry and they put Dad into the artillery, field artillery. So now he's with other men who were from Pine Bluff. And they were shipped off to Camp Kearney in San Diego, which was a much more pleasant place than the Mexican border, just outside of San Diego. I've seen the camp. And he was made in charge of the, what we call the ship service in the Navy, or the canteen in the Army, because he had some store business. They knew that. And they didn't need cavalry anymore, and he was assigned to the cannon anyway. So they put him in charge of the canteen. And he made money for the canteen, which they liked, of course. So this is where all the fellows came in to buy their stuff. And on occasion, he'd get a weekend liberty, and we'd go into the hotel in San Diego where they had matzo ball soup. This is the only thing he missed, really. And he would always go there with a couple of pals, and they'd have matzo ball soup. And this is called the U.S. Grant Hotel, which is still there, and I've been there. So at any rate, one of the people in his artillery squadron happened to be from Pine Bluff. His name was Leo Levine, about Dad's age. And so he would get letters from his sister, who happened to be the girl that my dad surreptitiously had fallen for while he waited on her shoes. And she wrote beautiful letters. He always had a beautiful handwriting. And he told him, he says, you know, he says, I think that's the girl I used to see at Fru's store. He says, would you do something for me if we live through this? We get back home. Would you formally introduce me to your sister? So he always read the letters that she'd write. So finally, everything's over. He's out of the Army. He goes back to Pine Bluff, and then my future uncle introduced him to his sister, which was my mother. Her name was Bertha Levine. It was a large family. There were 7 boys and girls, and my grandmother. So we'll go back now, to say 1898. My grandfather, on my mother's side, his name was Max Levine. He's buried in Bonham. Has been since 1910, a long time. Amy Cornblith, an attorney here, was also from Bonham and knew the family quite well, so we'll get that later. So at any rate, my father was in the cotton, my grandfather was in the cotton business, all out of New Orleans, which is where he was from Galveston originally, the Block family there, who were also in the Galveston flood, and a lot of them were wiped out, 1902 or something like that. So eventually, my uncle, one of my uncles, Sam Levine, went to Columbia University, and Phi Beta Kappa from Tulane College, and then came back to Arkansas. But this was after the family moved from Bonham, because they lived there for about 8 years. He did a lot of his cotton business there because of the black soil, they used to say, and back and forth, New Orleans, Bonham. So the family basically was brought up partly in Bonham. And my mother finished high school in Bonham. And she had 3 sisters, my aunts, and 2 other brothers. And all were moved to Pine Bluff because my grandfather died about 1910. Young man, probably 54 at best. Had Bright's disease, glomerulonephritis, which there's no treatment for then. So the older brother, my Uncle Jay, was in the cotton business with him. The young man, he was probably 19, 20 at best. So they figured Pine Bluff was a good place, a good cotton town then, and cotton was king. So they moved to Pine Bluff, and the whole family sort of grew up there, really. Anyway, that's how my father finally met my mother. By then, my uncle had become a member of the House of Representatives, which was kind of unusual in those days. It was about 1921 or 2 for a Jewish man. He was a sharp-looking fellow, though, and bright, Phi Beta Kappa, Columbia Law School, all this sort of thing, and a wonderful orations. So he was elected, later senator, state senator. He even ran for lieutenant governor in 1936. But they burned a few crosses. He decided, "No, I don't think that's such a good idea." He remained senator for many years. So anyway, so then my father meets my mother, and he dated her a bit. In those days, your date was a movie, walk down the street shopping on Saturday night, maybe, that sort of thing. And met all the family, and he was impressed with the family because, you know, these people, gosh, they went all the way back to 1820. Here he's just literally a greenhorn still, but he spoke perfect English now and everything else, totally Americanized. So he decided he wanted to marry her, and she had a boyfriend. I've forgotten, I knew his name, but I haven't recalled it in a long time, in Pine Bluff. And they always used to laugh. His name was Levy. Anyway, he used to walk down the street with a cane. He didn't need a cane, had a gold top on it. You know, big shot, boulevardier. So anyway, she was dating him. I don't think she was crazy about him. Apparently a nice guy. So Dad was interested in sort of breaking that up if he could. So at any rate, they dated for a while, nothing serious as far as my mother went. And by this time, she'd finished college now and began to teach third grade at the Fifth Avenue School. And they lived in a pretty big house on 808 Fifth Avenue in Pine Bluff, 2-story and everything, stairway, the usual. And so one day my mother came home from teaching school, and by that time she was probably 21, 22. And a trunk.
He by that time is how old?
Pardon?
How old is he by this
Oh,
time?
my dad was there was a 7-year difference.
Mhm.
So he was probably 27 now. He'd been in the service a couple of years, all of this, you know. And was totally with it, or so was she. But at any rate, when she arrived home from school one afternoon, my grandmother, who was a wonderful, probably got great pictures of her, terrific person, you know. And I've got papers from New Orleans when she was married in about 80, 1890. I've got even from the newspaper. At any rate, there was a trunk in the front hall, entrance hall, with a bow on it or something, and my grandmother said, "Is there something that I don't know?" She was always a pretty good diplomat, even when I was a kid. She said, "What do you mean?" She says, "This trunk arrived addressed to you. What's this all about?" She says, "What do you mean?" And she opens the card, and it's from my dad. A little card that says, "For your trousseau." She says, "Trousseau? What's he?" She met him. She said,
Yeah.
"I don't know what he's talking about." And my mother laughed too. She says, "I don't either. I've received no proposal. Maybe this is his way of doing it." She says, "Well, I'll tell you what you do. You call the company." It was from the Pine Bluff company. The luggage. Have them pick it up immediately. Take it back. So she did. And that was that. So I guess a few more weeks or months went by, and they were walking down the street, and so the story goes, and it's true, they've told me both this, confirmed it. Walking down the street one Saturday night, just looking in the windows after a movie and probably a couple of Cokes or something. And he asked her if she'd consider marrying him. She says, "If you can find the key to my heart." She said, "Well, I don't know about that." So another few weeks go by, and they're walking again one night, and he bends, he laughed about it. He bends over and picks up his old rusty key. She thinks he put it there. Old key, and who's gonna know? And he says, "Here's the key to your heart." She died laughing, she accepted. So anyway, I thought that was kind of nice. I've written all this stuff, single typewritten stuff, for my kids someday if they're interested. But at any rate, so they were married in Pine Bluff, and my uncle, who was my dad's youngest brother, Milton Frank, came from St. Louis to be the best man. This was in 1921. Well, by now, he had settled in St. Louis and was working, selling shoes on the road, traveling man. And of course, I wasn't born yet. I was born in 1925. And well, this comes getting ahead of the story here. Go forever. So they were married. They honeymooned in Memphis, so they could catch the train easily from Little Rock to Memphis, which is about a 2-hour ride in those days, at the Gayoso Hotel, which is across from the old Peabody Hotel. And it's still there too. And they always laugh because he was worn out from all the traveling back and forth and everything. And by this time he was working for a store in Russellville, Arkansas. Okay, that's about 75 miles west of Little Rock. Remember, there were no interstates. There were interstates, but they were 2-lane highways, not 6 lanes like Pennsylvania Turnpike. So he was already there and had a place to live, an apartment or whatever they did. They had boarding houses. And that's where she was going to move to as soon as they came back from the honeymoon. So during the honeymoon, the first night, they had chicken a la king. And my dad always said, "Best chicken a la king I ever had." He said, of course, it was a honeymoon. And so they had that. And then I don't know what they did. She laughed because he went to sleep somewhere down the line. You know, it was a honeymoon. He's worn out. So she never forgave him for that, she said. So they're back now, and they moved to Russellville. Now, again, her family was all in Pine Bluff. It's 100 miles away to Marlton. Well, Russellville first. And he was the head of a manager of a store there, something Goldman store, 2-story department store. And Russellville, a town of about 20,000, which were big towns in those days. And the headquarters was in Memphis. Mr. Goldman, I never met him. And they catered to all kinds of customers and everything. And it was a pretty successful thing, and he was the manager. And my uncle came from St. Louis to work for my dad in this store. Dad being the manager, he could hire him. And he was younger, a couple of years younger than Dad. So they're doing fine. And incidentally, this guy Goldman, something or other he put in the newspaper, which was a negative thing against Jews. Now, you must recall, in those days, there were a few Jews living in these smaller towns, very few. I think the dad and my uncle were the only ones in Russellville. Now, people weren't anti-anything. They just never considered it one way or another, as far as I can tell. But this guy Goldman, from him, had something to do with anti-Semitic almost, and he's Jewish. And my mother's in Russellville now, and she was always pretty active at the University of Chicago and became active in the civic organizations. And she was a good speaker too, and book reviews, things of that nature, and fit in very well. And besides that, she was raised partly in Bonham, in New Orleans, but not many Jewish people around, so she knew how to adjust very quickly. And they didn't appear too Semitic or anything. And she was mad as a dickens. And she always told me that story. And she called this guy Goldman in Memphis and chewed him up and down, told him who she was, and she's not going to stand for that. And he better put something back in the Russellville newspaper denying all of this and apologizing, which he did. So she was pretty proud of that, but she had no unctions about not doing it. So anyway, This went on they were there for about a year and a half. I think they had a apartment sort of, it's a doctor's home. His name was Dr. Gordon, as a matter of fact, which is my first name, but it has nothing to do with that. And they got along very well. But they finally decided they'd bring my younger uncle, Milton, from St. Louis. He was still selling shoes. They'd set him up in a grocery store. Well, he didn't like that for longer than a few months, according to the history I got. And he was a young guy, you know, and active and so forth, not married yet. And neither was the other uncle yet. So he decided to go back.
These are your dad's?
My dad's brothers,
Yeah.
Milton Frank. So he decided to go back to St. Louis, where he felt more at home and so forth, and didn't enjoy the grocery business, and I don't blame him. So he gets back there, and there was a fellow by the name of David P. Wohl, W-O-H-L, who had founded the Wohl Shoe Company, which was coming along pretty well, ladies' shoes. And of course, it was a big wholesale place in those days, St. Louis. They sold to all the small stores everywhere, including Bob Strauss's father's store, south of Austin, I believe. And all of these, you know, I didn't know any of these things until later, but so forth. So he's in St. Louis, and he was back selling shoes. So by this time, my dad and my uncle decided to open their own business, or as they say in Texas, business. So they began to look around, and they'd been in Arkansas for quite some time. And the next town up the road closer to Little Rock was Morrilton, M-O-R-R-I-L-T-O-N, which is incidentally in the Dallas Morning News fairly often, because Petty Jean State Park is a big mountain park, and the lieutenant governor later came from there, Congressional Medal of Honor winners. So that's my town, literally. I'm proud of that. At any rate, so they settled there. And the only Jews in town. Nobody even thought about it, neither did they. So when they went in to find a place to open the store, the banks, you know, were all private banks, and they weren't backed by any FDIC, Marlton First State Bank, this bank, Rainwater Bank, all this kind of thing. So the ones that owned the building that they thought was the appropriate to open a store, and it had 2 stories, it was owned by the Rainwaters. So Dad says, you know, he says, I'm not familiar with this sort of thing, you know, leases, rents, whatever you do. My mother says, you want me to go talk to him? You know, after all, she'd been raised in the South and everything. And he says, I'd certainly appreciate it. So she dressed up, and she loved to describe it. She says, I walk into the Rainwater Bank, introduce myself, I'm Bertha Levine Frank, originally from Bonham, Pine Bluff, and New Orleans. And she told him what she was there for. And my husband's waiting in the car. It was a car that he and my uncle shared. I think it was an old Ford that had curtains that came down the side of the rain, this sort of thing. This is 1922. So, at any rate, Mr. Rainwater, one of these, not cowboy types, you know, cowboy hat, boots, this sort of thing, but obviously a pretty well-educated man. First thing he does is lean back in his chair and put the boots up on the desk. You know? She laughed about that, not in front of him, but she said, she proposed what they wanted to do. And he says, well, hadn't thought about it. He says, the building's empty, though, and whatever he said. And he agreed to it. He says, how soon do they want to do that? Well, as soon as we can do some repairs inside. He said, well, I can fix that up for you, and that sort of thing. She said, he says, now you say your name is Levine. And he says, are you Jewish? And she says, yes, absolutely. He didn't even question that. So that was it, as far as any further mention of religion, as far as I ever knew. And it never was. They fit right in. There was one other Jewish family. They were called the Riches. I never knew them. I don't know what they did exactly, but they weren't too well liked. That was the word that got around. It had nothing to do with religion. They left town, which my dad and uncle and my mother were very happy to see. They weren't the kind of folks you'd want to represent you necessarily, you know, old Southern type, all that. So at any rate, so they started the business. Of course, it didn't have a lot of credit, but the dad went up to St. Louis. He represented the ladies' ready-to-wear, ladies' shoes. My uncle did the men's wear, the shoes and so forth. So it was a two-story department store. No elevator, not in those days. We did have an elevator at the First State Bank, which was 8 stories high in my hometown. Tallest building west of the Mississippi before Little Rock. So anyway, proud of that. Big deal.
And so the date on the date on this?
On that building?
Mhm.
Goodness, it had to be,
No, the date that you went into it.
the store, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, see, I wasn't born yet.
I know.
Oh,
The date that they started the store.
the start of the store was
Yeah.
about 1923.
Okay.
And Dad said, he often said, he even laughed at me years later, he says, you know, if we'd have gotten 10 cents on the dollar for all the merchandise we bought, I'd have taken it right then and left.
Mhm.
You know, who guaranteed anything in those days? Geez. So they managed through the companies in St. Louis. And within about 5 years, things were going apparently just tremendously well. And he always was proud because he has a letter that he saved from Rice Sticks. Now they're big, these are huge wholesale houses. I mean, 2 blocks long. I don't mean little places. Ely Walker, which had a representative in Dallas years later. Rice Sticks, Blackwell Wheeling, I could go on down the line. Huge places, and they sold all over the country. And so he had a letter, must have been within 6 or 7 years, from this Rice Sticks. And they were Jewish too, I'm sure. I never checked on it. Congratulations, you've done a swell job in your store, and we're raising your credit, I think up to $1 million. And he saved that letter. I've still got the letter. So he was proud of that. They never did things on credit in those days. Very few people did. They had layaway plans. You laid it away, no interest, and you paid so much, whatever you felt like you'd pay. And they have stacks of these things, suits and dresses and stuff. Then when they pay it off, great, here it is. No interest, nothing like that. Just didn't do it. And it worked extremely well. Anyway, they became quite popular. It's the county seat, and it served 4 or 5 counties around, mostly farming communities. Now, this is just 50 miles from Little Rock. But it was a pretty classy town, a country club, and beautiful homes, and this sort of thing, and just great place to grow up. So at any rate, this is now 1926, 27, 25, I'm born. I was born in Pine Bluff, because we had a good hospital there, and all the family, my mother's family was there, and this sort of thing. And so the story goes, when they hauled me out after I was born, my uncle, the senator, one of my favorite uncles, obviously, picked me up as a baby, and he says, you know, he smiled at me. And I always remember that. Not important here, but still. Anyway, the rest of the family, so we'll talk about my Uncle Milton now. St. Louis, young fella.
Save some time to talk about you.
Oh, my God. That could take,
Okay.
that could take weeks. But I will say briefly about Uncle Milton.
Okay.
He went to work for Wool Shoe Company, David P. Wool, who was now a pretty big outfit on Washington Avenue in St. Louis. And he was made the vice president because he was good with people, good with everything, really, and just a swell guy. And my dad was going up on the train. They didn't fly in those days, in the 20s, late 20s, on the train to St. Louis to make some more purchases from the wholesale houses. And on the train was David P. Wool, Sr., who was the founder of this outfit, a little older than Dad. And he told Dad, he says, Al, he says, you know, he says, are you happy where you are? And he said, absolutely. He says, well, I know your store's doing pretty well. He says, but why don't you come on to St. Louis and join Wool Shoe Company? That's where you belong, this sort of thing. And Dad said the temptation was great, but they'd been in business now for 6 or 7 years, and things were going fine. He says, no, he says, we were pretty well established in this community and feel good about it all. And I don't think I need that. Thank goodness he didn't. Anyway, as the years go by, my uncle became finally the president of Wool Shoe Company. And by this time, the Wools had a son, David Wool Jr., whom I met at a boys' camp in Wisconsin, Camp Nebagaman, I have several. Vic Hexter was a campmate of mine, Louis Wadle. I've known them since we were 12 years old. But this is a camp in northern Wisconsin. But that's a whole story in itself. So Uncle Milton, eventually, Dave Wool's son was killed in the war as a bomber pilot. And he had all this future ahead of him, disappeared over Germany, that was the end of that, shot down. This is about killed the father, this is many years later. By now my uncle's president of the company. And then later, David Wool Sr. died, and Brown Shoe Company, which is one of the largest in the country, New York Stock Exchange, took over Wool and put my uncle on the board of directors of Brown Shoe Company. Then he became the man of the year in St. Louis, business-wise. And they had all this veiled prophets ball and all this kind of stuff up there. So from zero to that, and that's where he finished up his life. And very happy, and I've got cousins all for them. So now you want me, my life, well, okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely, oh God.
You moved here in what year?
Oh, I see what you mean. 1958.
Mm.
I met my wife Paula in Chicago. She was from Dallas. She had just finished Northwestern University in Evanston, which is a suburb of Chicago. And I had gone to the University of Chicago Medical School. Now, I had joined the Navy in World War II at 17 years old. And I was sent to Tulane University as a pre-med student, but I was a sailor, as a Navy unit. And then they took a bunch of us, middle of the war, decided they needed more officers. I was 18 years old, kind of unusual. And they
But
decided.
going to college at the same
I
time?
was at Tulane, in a Navy unit though. It was all accelerated courses, pre-med. There were pre-engineers, there were about 800 of us. And they decided they wanted more officers, which suited us just fine. We're sick and tired of all this studying. And we were afraid the war might end before we got into it. Well, this was 1944, so we've got a long way to go. So they changed us to pre-midshipman. At the Naval Academy, you were a midshipman when you entered, but we were pre-midshipman. We weren't going to the Naval Academy, but they had 4 midshipman schools in the country. One was at Notre Dame, of all places. No ocean near Notre Dame, to train sailors. That was Northwestern, Lake Michigan, Columbia University, New York, and Port Schuyler, New York, which is where I was sent. And at the end of 4 months, I was commissioned a lieutenant in the Navy. I wasn't even 19 yet, but believe me, we grew up in a hurry. And then I was shipped out to anti-submarine warfare school and then on the destroyer. And I was a navigator on the destroyer. By now I'm 19. And you know, all the fancy uniform, and all grown up. And most of the young guys were 8 officers and 300 enlisted men on the ship. And you're in charge of all these enlisted men, and responsible and everything. And believe me, it was serious business. I was on convoy duty, taking troops across, ammunition, to North Africa. The British fleet would meet us at Gibraltar, and we would refuel at sea and head right back for the States, make another run.
Never got to Germany, huh?
Well, this was in the Navy,
Mm.
so no reason to
Yeah.
get to Germany. But I have to mention that I have pictures of my grandfather, who was born in Germany in 1856, is buried there in this little village of Laufersweiler. And they took me when I was 3.5 years old. They didn't believe in leaving you with a nanny. You know, you're going to take your kid with you. 3 months to Europe, 1929. The Depression had not quite hit. Took ships over, the Leviathan and the George Washington, which later I found out were historical ships. President Wilson, all these people took those ships. You didn't fly. Lindbergh had just made it 2 years before. So at any rate, that's just backwards. And I visited that village several times with Paula, and when I was 3.5, with my dad and my mother. And in Berlin, where my grandmother now lived at that time, I have pictures of us in Berlin. I've got stories about myself long before Dallas. about being left with my grandmother when they went to the opera. And they took me to the opera one night because they couldn't get a babysitter. And some of my grandmother's friends, and of course Dad still spoke excellent German, so that don't sweat. But we were taken to the Berlin Opera House. What did I know? It's a big place. And they wouldn't let me in. 3.5-year-old, he was going to disturb the whole audience, all in German. And Dad knew how to push him around. And he was a pretty big guy, too. And he just shouted them out. He says, my boy's going in, in German. So I knew a few words in German that they had taught me. So as we were standing there waiting to go in this line, the people in tuxedos, I remember that. Dad had a top hat, crushable, he popped it out, and tails. Mother had a formal gown on, and as we left this big apartment house where my grandmother lived, and I remember I've got the street number and everything, which half destroyed in the war, I'm sure, but nonetheless, as we were walking down the street aboard this taxi to go to the opera house, one of my grandmother's friends shouted at my mother, Frau Frank, deine Strümpfen sind gefallen. Well, that meant your stockings were falling down. So mother never got over that. She didn't speak any German, but we had a Catholic priest in my hometown, the Catholic church. A lot of Germans lived there, and Italians too, and they taught her some German. She had taken lessons, and she knew what that meant. Stockings were falling. So we laugh about that even to this day. We get to the opera house, they wouldn't let me in, so they said, all right, well, one deal. He's got to keep his mouth shut. Can't say a word, One word, and haraus. Out you go. Kicked me out of the opera house. So anyway, I sat there, and I remember between my mother and Dad, I'm a little guy, and I'm dressed up, shirt, tie, all this stuff. And I fell asleep. But I'm sitting up straight, my head's down, I'm sure. But the audience couldn't tell, piles of people there. And at the end of this whole thing, it was Die Fledermaus. Now, that was one of my dad's favorite light operas, and it later became mine. And every time I hear it, I think of the opera in Berlin, because when it was over, the crowd, stood up and hurrahed everybody, this, that, and the other. The next thing you know, as we started out, all these Germans came rushing over and patting me on the head and the shoulder. Wunderbar. I understood some of the words, Wunderkind. Oh, he looked at the opera the whole time. He did not a peep. He's sitting up perfectly straight. My head was down, I'm sure. They couldn't tell. And all this. And I looked up at him and I said, Ich bin ein guter Knabe, which means I'm a good boy in German. That sent him wild. Here's this American kid, Perfect accent. Anyway, now let's get back to Dallas.
It's interesting that you grew up in towns, not many Jews, but it sounds like you were able to keep your Judaism intact.
Well, good story. I mean, it's not a short story. I would say, even so, and they weren't ashamed in any way, when the high holidays came, we always went to Little Rock. Well, it's a 50-mile trip, hour and 10 minutes you're there. And besides that, Mother being from Pine Bluff, knew a lot of people in Little Rock. They'd all married people and moved to Little Rock from Pine Bluff. And the department stores, Gus Blass, these names don't mean it, Kempner's, Pfeiffer's, all were there. So she had all these friends there too. So you'd close the store for the day, and with a sign, closed on account of holiday, period. And they'd go. Now, Dad was probably raised, I think, in a conservative. They had a temple in this Laufertsweiler. I've been there too, just 3 years ago. And it was a SS headquarters in World War II, but the building is still there. It is still a temple. They turned it back again. Gorgeous building. I mean, walls this thing. At any rate, where was I?
They had built.
How we got, so the religious angle, maybe about every other Friday night, Mother, we always ate at the dining room table anyway, unless we were in the coffee room or something. And the tablecloth, everybody had a maid maids in those days were $5 a week, and they came 7 days a week, cooked everything else. You know, it was the old mammy type thing. It was great. Kid, we just assumed it. And white tablecloth, everything prepared. Not the ceremony like we know, but I read the Bible a little bit. Dad could read Hebrew. He learned that before he left his town in Germany, and still could. So he'd recite a few things in Hebrew, and I didn't know that, but we'd say a few prayers in English, candles, and that was it. But enough to know what you were.
Mm-hmm.
And they always told me, they said, now, son, as you grow up here, you know, you won't always be here, but just remember one thing. Says you fit in fine, nobody knows, nobody questions, it's nothing. It's nothing to be ashamed of either. Says, but there's one thing you must stress to yourself. You're the only Jew, young Jew here. And I had a cousin, a girl, my uncle's daughter, and she was about a year younger than I said, so whatever you do, you never talk with your hands, you never raise your voice, you speak very quietly, and you always behave yourself in the proper manner, because you represent all the Jews these people will ever know, maybe. Of course, that's not true. Later, they do plenty, but still, then, you represent everybody. So don't do anything to make everybody ashamed. And I took that to heart, and I believed it, and that's the way I was raised. So later, as I became older, 9, 10 years old, they said, well, I think it's time to go to Sunday school. Well, by this time, Mother had kept up with all these people in Little Rock, the Reformed Temple. In fact, the rabbi married the Wadle, Carol Wadle's parents in Kansas City. Sanders, Rabbi Sanders was his name, and he was a rabbi for years. Anyway, he was there, so they shipped my cousin and I, every Sunday, they drove us to Little Rock. You get up about 8 in the morning, get there by 8:30, 9 o'clock, go to Sunday school. It's over by noon, and that's how I was confirmed, literally. So I knew where I was.
Were you bar mitzvah?
In those days, the word was never even spoken of.
Mhm.
Bat mitzvah, I didn't even know what the word meant. You know, in Little Rock, it was all a Reformed temple. There must have been at least 1,500 Jews in Little Rock at that time.
Wow.
Big crowd, you know. No conservative, no Orthodox that I know of at all. So it was a whole different bag. And all mostly in English, of course. You learned some proper prayers, but nonetheless. So I was there, and I met all the guys in my class. That my mother's best friend was their mother. I had, you know, for all those years. Now we're all 10, 11, 12 years old. And she received a call one day from one of the mothers. She says, we're going to send Alan, this is Tallheimer. Incidentally, his son founded, was it Greater Image? What was that?
Sharper Image.
Sharper Image, founded in San Francisco. His son did that, founded those stores, and is now out of it. But nonetheless, Alan is still a close friend of mine. So she called my mother. She says, we're thinking about sending Alan and his cousin Max Hyman, to this boys' camp in northern Wisconsin. Would you be interested in sending Gordon? And she said, well, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So it's a Jewish camp. Fine, even better. So it's the director's from St. Louis. Camp's been there 10 years. It's been there 85 years now. I still go to the camp. But at any rate, so we were shipped out that June. This was 1938. Kids, I was 12 years old, and he was 12. The others maybe 13, 14. 6 of us all going to camp. Didn't feel badly because we had friends we knew now. On the train, you didn't fly on TWA, and it was overnight to way up near Duluth, Minnesota. So at any rate, so we, I remember all the parents were there at the Union Station in Little Rock to see us off. You know, there was 6 of us, so there was twice that number of parents, you know. And everybody was happy. And of course, we all knew the parents too, and they knew my parents, like one big family in a way. And I remember waving out of the door. It was hot as a dickens. I was wearing Vaseline hair tonic, and it got in my collar, it got in my eyes.
got
We all were,
memory.
you know. Oh, memory, I've recorded it all. So anyway, now we're on the train, see, and it's a Pullman. We had sleeping berths, upper and lower berths, not compartments, not for young guys. So overnight to Chicago, going to be back in Chicago. My parents told me, they said, now, when you arrive in St. Louis, you seem a little apprehensive about all this. We're not forcing you. We just think it'd be a great advantage for you. 2 whole months. I mean, you're gone 2 months away. 1,500 miles, you know. And this is a long way in those days. So they said, so when you get to St. Louis, it'll be midnight. You'll be in your berths, hopefully sleeping. But if you decide that you change your mind, simply tell the conductor, get off the train, and call Uncle Milton in St. Louis. And he'll pick you up and send you back home. So I remember the train pulled in at midnight, in the middle of the station. I raised the shade, people walking back and forth outside. Thought to myself, geez, the rest of these guys can do it. My friends, why shouldn't I? I remember thinking that through clearly. I said, go ahead, be brave. So away we went. Overnight, we get into Chicago the next morning. The camp director meets us. Muggs Lorber is his name. And he greets us, he piles us up. We go to the LaSalle Hotel, which is the camp headquarters. And guys coming from all over the country. Just 150, though, in the camp at that time. Counselors from all over. Most of the counselors were, either college or had finished college or were teachers. So they were all solid people, you know. We didn't know that. So we had spent the day in Chicago. They wanted to wear us out so we'd sleep well because you went out on the camp train that night. The whole train, nothing but our camp. About 15 carloads of boys, you know, and a counselor on each car. So sleepers again, overnight to northern Wisconsin. So we had a choice of going to the Cubs game or Museum of Science and Industry, and I think I elected the Museum of Science and Industry. So we spent the whole day having all this fun. We board the train and away we go. Next day we were met by a bunch of trucks.
We've got 3 more minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes, okay. We get back to Dallas now. Oh, yeah, that's how I met most of my Jewish friends, other than Little Rock, at this camp.
Well, it sounds like Dallas was your first really big town that you lived in.
Not really, because I went to the University of Chicago, medical school, internship, and then 4 years of residency in ophthalmology. So I lived in Chicago for 9 years. Prior to that, I had visited in Chicago with all my camp friends, and they with me in Little Rock, and that sort of thing. And besides,
How do you like Dallas? Because this
oh,
is
I
where-
say I've never had regrets about that.
Yeah.
I could have gone to Little Rock. Folks, I'm an only son, no brothers, no sisters. And they said, we hate to send you away, but you know, we think you could stay in Little Rock, have a bird's nest on the ground, you know everybody, open your practice. But they were just getting over all that trouble with the troops and the integration and the Faubus and all this crowd. They said, we think you do better in Dallas. It's a big city, but look over things. So I had an offer to go to Beverly Hills, California, an ophthalmologist there. So before all of this, we said, well, let's go out and look. They said, well, we'll back you up. We're not going to. By then, we had a baby in Chicago. I stayed there a year and a half at Northwestern at the medical school. They gave me an appointment on the faculty to teach and work for the head of the whole department. He was a pretty internationally known ophthalmologist, Derek Vail. I thought, what an opportunity. But I didn't want to live in Chicago the rest of my life. Too big. Geez, now my friends there, but different. So anyway, they said, we'll back you up. Won't let the baby starve. You all just look around, take your time. So we went out to Beverly Hills, spent a week, met the guy, swell fella, Henry Nesbern, and he let me operate, observe, make sure I'm adequate surgeon, and then met some of his patients, see how I could work with them. First one was Spencer Tracy. I couldn't believe this. I says, "This is your patient?" She said, "Yeah." He says, "Just another guy." And all these people were coming. They were all movie actors and actresses. Those were his patients. And so I thought, man, this is great. Wow, what an opportunity. So the last night we were there, he said, "Well, I'd like to have you." He said, "My son's at Harvard. He's finishing his training in ophthalmology. Will be joining me in a couple of years. So he'll be a junior partner, but maybe we can make you a full-time in 5 years." This, that, and the other thing. So then he said, "Now there's one last request I have. When you get back to Chicago, think it over." He says, "Do you think you could develop a slight British accent?" And I looked at him, I said, "This guy's got to be kidding. I can't believe this." He said, I says, "Well, is that important?" He says, "Very important here." I says, "Why?" He says, "Because they like it. They like the British accent." So I laughed. I says, "Well, I was a member of the National Thespian Society in high school. I acted in plays. Have a terrific German accent, a little bit of Italian." I says, "I could develop a British accent, but what happens if I settle here in your office, we've been here for 5 months, and suddenly I slip up, and a patient comes in like Gary Cooper or Lana Turner, who knows?" And I said, and I accidentally say, "Now, y'all, it's sure good to see you here. We're going to have grits." I says, "How would that work?" I was kidding, of course. He says, "Well, if you can't do," I says, "I don't think I can, no." So anyway, we came back to Dallas, and I introduced myself to, there were about 40 ophthalmologists in the whole city at that time. Most of them were very kind. And they said, "Well, we think you do very well here. In fact, we'll give you our overflow if you like." I said, "Like?" Oh, 5 minutes, gotta shut up.
Did I leave my purse here? Stop.